Hello, I'm Malcolm Macintosh. I'm a lecturer in the School of Management in RMIT Melbourne, and I'm going to talk to you today about the topic skills and services in the course. Skills and services has three main themes, and they are service economies, what is a service economy, flexible work and emotional labour. And let me talk to you very briefly about each of these themes that will come out in more detail later. And you'll also see some of these things explored in the textbook. The service economy. Well, the service economy is a concept that grew up as far back as the 1960s in the work of a gentleman called Daniel Bell. And he developed a very elaborate theory which suggested that the structure of employment and occupations in the contemporary world of work would change quite radically towards the end of the 20th century. And his prediction was that there would grow up to replace an industrial workforce, an industrial production, an economy which was essentially based on services and service work. Now, this was taken up with a great deal of enthusiasm at the time as indicating that the world of the future would look a lot more like one of those films you see about the great futures that we all desire, one where everybody wears a suit and tie and works in a white-collar office, and we have a very relaxed and interactive work environment. The reality of the world has been slightly different, as I think some of you would understand from your own experiences. Bell's predictions were really based on very little evidence and a lot of projections about the way technology would transform work. And he also seemed to ignore a lot of the underpinning of the very service economy itself, and that is the continuation of industrial production. And what we have probably realised now in the early part of the 21st century is certainly that service work has become a much more noticeable and important part of a contemporary economy. And if you're in Singapore, of course, I don't have to tell you how important the service economy is seen. But there is no doubt that manufacturing things that we all consume remains a very important part of any economy. Indeed, what has probably happened is that a lot of those manufacturing jobs that were associated by Bell with the American economy of the 60s have gone to other countries, to China, to Vietnam and other parts of the world, as global production underpins the growth of a global economy. So what we have now is a much more complex economy made up of service jobs and of manufacturing jobs. And even within manufacturing, I think you would see service occupations as being a very important element. For instance, on a production line in a modern factory, the interaction of work groups within the workforce is an important service function going on. So that's the service economy. The second part of the lecture relates to flexible work. Flexible work is not associated solely and only with the service economy. It's associated really with the underlying need for modern employers to achieve greater productivity with less supervision of their workforce. And there are two kinds of major approaches to flexibility. One of those is known as functional flexibility. And it's this kind of flexibility which is seen to be, I suppose, the most desirable by many of us, because it involves people in having a multiplicity of skills and sharing and working with others to do their tasks on a day-to-day basis. So that if I'm feeling a little low and don't come in to my job on time tomorrow morning, I know that somebody else in that workplace will be able to pick up my tasks and perform them. Or perhaps we're sharing within our group about who does the more complex tasks of calculating perhaps, and others are doing some of the other processing tasks. So we work together to share the functions of the job that we are all focused on. But the other part of flexibility is a different kind of flexibility. It's often referred to as numerical flexibility. And this relates to variations in people's work time and working hours. Now this sounds good. It means that we could perhaps have many people working in jobs for just a few hours a day, or maybe bulking up a 40-hour week into 3 days and having the rest of the week to themselves. But the reality is that this approach to flexibility, numerical flexibility, is often used to break up jobs in a way that suits a lot of part-time and casual workers rather than a full-time workforce. So numerical flexibility is often associated with a degradation of permanent employment and the growth of a much larger casualised workforce. The third part of this topic relates to emotional labour. And now emotional labour is something that you won't immediately be able to identify in your head, but it's possibly something you may have experienced if you've done any part-time work. If, for instance, you've worked in the food industry, perhaps in McDonald's, while you're at school or during holiday periods, you would have been expected to behave in a very particular way with the customers. And if you think about it, what you're being asked to do is often act out a role of a friend to the customer. You greet them as though they are somebody you've needed to know for a long time, and you always say goodbye with something like, have a good day, a phrase that we really get very sick of hearing, I think, but it's nevertheless part of the whole process of making the customer feel wanted and hoping that they'll come back to experience that treatment once more. Now, for most of us, of course, those kinds of emotional expressions of our relationship, in this case with the customer, are based on our experience with our families and our friends, and they're not too hard to transfer into a simple transaction like a fast food outlet. But there are some times in the workforce when we're expected to go much more into more complex emotions and act something we don't understand. We often find this in sales jobs, for instance, where we have to actually promote the advantages of a product or a service, which perhaps really in our hearts we're a little unsure about. Now here we're going against ourselves in a way. We're doing this for money. The emotional task in this case has been defined by our managers, not by ourselves. It is not something we learnt in our family or in our schools. It's something that's been imposed on the way we work with other people. So emotional labour, which is now seen to be an essential aspect of servicing clients and customers in the service economy, is a two-edged sword. It can be very positive in terms of building business and business relationships, but it can be very negative in terms of how I feel about my job and how I feel about the integrity of my own contribution to that job.